Today is September the 7th. The title of our devotional is A Path for Success. Our scripture reading is Psalm 39 and 2 Samuel chapter 8. Now our devotional itself is taken from the narrative of David's life in 2 Samuel chapter 8. Now I've given a title to 2 Samuel 8, David's Success and Victories as King. If a boy in Israel had been looking for a hero, he would have looked no further than King David. The king's life was a testimony of what God can do with a man who loves the Lord and is fully yielded to his will. The first years of David's reign were marked by continual success. And when God denied him the opportunity to build a temple, the king accepted the rejection with humility, and then he set about extending Israel's territory and securing the rule over his domain. Confident in the Lord's promises and obedient to his laws and commandments, David defeated one adversary after another. Now, the first to fall in 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 1 was that of the Philistines, who resided in the territories that were west and south of Israel. Eventually, a line of kings and kingdoms fell to David and to Israel, or they began paying tribute to David. The Moabites, descendants of Lot, who occupied the land on the east side of the Jordan River, were the next to be conquered in verse 2. In verse 3, and really all the way through, I think, verse 8 or 9, we find King Hadaezer of Zobah, a capital city north of Damascus, whose lands occupied territories that included a portion of ancient Israel reaching to the Euphrates River. And Hadadezer's forces suffered a harsh defeat. Now, Hadadezer's kingdom boasted 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 20,000 footmen. Surely a great army in that day. Well, David, after defeating Hadadezer's army, had the chariot horses of his enemy hoed. Now, the word hoed is the idea of clipping their hamstrings. The horses themselves would have been able to be mobile. They would have been able to pull plows. However, they would not have ever again been able to go into battle against Israel. Now, when the Syrians came to aid Hadadezer, David sorely defeated them as well, slaying of the Syrians 22,000 men. While the king then secured the land of Israel by placing garrisons, that is, army troops, if you would, in Syria of Damascus. And the Syrians themselves became the servants of David, and they began bringing gifts, paying tribute. And we read this statement, verse 6. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. Now, the bounty of the spoils of war were brought by David to Jerusalem, including shields of gold. We'll see those in a later devotional from the servants of Hadaezer, and exceeding much brass. Now, we know, according to 1 Chronicles chapter 18, that all of that brass that was brought to Jerusalem by David would end up being melted down by his son Solomon, and out of it would be fashioned various vessels for the temple. Now, David continued his conquest. The next, in verse 12, he defeated the Amalekites. In verse 14, he defeated the Edomites, and they accepted David and served him and Israel. 2 Samuel 8 and verse 13, we read this statement, David gat him a name. That is, his reputation as a warrior king continued to grow. Now, as we near the close of this devotional, we ask the question, what was the secret to David's achievements? Was he successful because of his skill as a general and warrior on the battlefield? Was it loyalty of his leaders or the size of his army that gave him success? Well, the secret to David's successes and his military exploits was summed up in this statement that we find in verse 6 and verse 14. The Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. Then in turn, David's response to the Lord was this, that he executed judgment and justice unto all his people. Let me say this. The victories of David fulfilled God's covenant promises to Israel, made to Abraham many, many centuries before. Now here's a closing thought for you. Who among us does not long for success? Everyone I have known wants to be successful. They want to enjoy the fruits of their success. And yet, how many are willing to follow David's example, model humility, and walk faithfully in the ways of the Lord? David, though a powerful king whose fame was growing, nevertheless, David was committed to do right and to execute righteous judgment and justice to all his people. There's a challenge for you as a leader. Walk in humility. Be humble before the Lord. Treat your employees as one that executes the right judgment. That is, that you're determined to do right no matter what the cost might be. God bless you. Thank you for following this Heart of a Shepherd. God bless and bye-bye.